I was in the tunnel when I first understood what we were doing. Not the locker room, not the training pitch, not the Federation offices where men in suits made decisions I wasn't invited to question. The tunnel, beneath the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California. July 17, 1994. The air down there had a specific quality: cold concrete, sweat, liniment oil, and something else underneath it all that I've never been able to name. Something like dread. He was standing maybe 4 feet from me, rolling his right ankle in slow circles the way he always did before a match. Clockwise, then counterclockwise, twice each direction. It was ritual. I'd watched it hundreds of times, but that afternoon I watched his jaw instead of his ankle. The way it locked when the rotation hit a certain angle. The way he breathed through it. Not in, not out, just held. Like a man stepping on broken glass and deciding not to look down. I had taped that ankle myself 3 hours earlier. I knew exactly what was underneath the tape. Let me go back to the beginning, because the injury didn't start in Pasadena. It started 6 weeks earlier, in a training session outside Boston that nobody was supposed to discuss. A lateral collision, nothing dramatic, no crack, no immediate drop to the ground. He finished the session. He always finished. That was the thing about him that made everyone love him, and ultimately, that made everything that followed possible. He had a threshold for pain that the rest of us interpreted as strength. I'm not sure anymore that it was. The scan that evening showed a syndesmotic tear. High ankle sprain, for those who don't know the terminology. The kind that, under normal circumstances, carries a minimum 6 to 8 week recovery window. Under normal circumstances, a player with that scan result does not compete in a World Cup final 18 days later. I presented the scan to the head of the medical team at 7 the following morning. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that I thought he was going to say the right thing. He said, "How much can we manage it?" I want to be precise about that word. Manage. Not heal, not protect. Manage, as though the ankle was a scheduling conflict. As though the ligament fibers that were partially severed were simply an inconvenience to be administered around. I said, "At this level of competition, not well." He nodded slowly, the way men nod when they've already made a decision and are simply waiting for the conversation to end. "We'll manage it," he said. What followed was 23 days of the most elaborate medical theater I have ever witnessed. Twice daily treatment sessions that were listed in the official schedule as general conditioning. Ice, compression, anti-inflammatory injections that we kept off the formal medication log because the quantities were beyond what the protocol allowed. I administered 3 of those injections myself. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I was not a bystander. I was not a man standing outside a room, listening through the door. I was inside the room. I was the room. He never complained. That's the part that still sits in my chest like something that won't dissolve. In 23 days of treatment, most of it genuinely painful, he never once used the word hurt. He would lie on the treatment table and stare at the ceiling and answer my questions with single words. Tight, stiff, fine. He had a way of saying fine that communicated nothing and everything simultaneously. I asked him once, this was maybe 10 days before the final, during a session that ran late into the evening when the facility was empty. I asked him quietly whether he wanted to tell me how it actually felt. He turned his head and looked at me. He had very still eyes. The kind that don't move around when they're looking at you. He said, "It feels like the World Cup final in 10 days. I didn't push it. I should have pushed it." I've had 30 years to understand that I should have pushed it, and 30 years of choosing not to examine too closely why I didn't. The match itself was, you know what the match was. Goalless after 90 minutes, goalless after extra time. Penalty shootout, Brazil wins. The whole world watches Roberto Baggio's send the deciding penalty over the bar and sink to his knees in that image that everyone knows. I was on the bench. I was watching him, not Baggio. He played the full 120 minutes. I watched him compensate for the ankle in real time. The slight shift in his plant foot, the way he avoided certain directional cuts. The moments where a half-second hesitation replaced what should have been an instinctive movement. A scout watching tape might have called it a quiet game. I was watching a man solve a physical equation in real time for 2 hours straight while 44 countries broadcast his face. He didn't go down, he didn't grimace for the cameras. At no point during those 120 minutes did anything visible suggest that he was operating on a partially torn syndesmosis held together with pharmaceutical intervention and athletic tape. After the shootout, in the chaos of the Brazilian celebration, I found him sitting alone in a corner of the locker room. Everyone else was either devastated or performing devastation. He was just sitting, still. He had his boot off and he was looking at his ankle. And the swelling that had been artfully managed for 3 weeks had expressed itself completely. Now the whole joint was wrong, visibly, unarguably wrong. He looked up when he heard me come in. "Done," he said, just that one word. I've tried to decide for decades what it meant. The tournament, the match, the performance, the ankle, the career, all of it. Maybe none of those things. Maybe the word meant something I don't have access to. Here's what happened in the 18 months that followed, and I'll be brief because the brevity is the point. He returned to his club. The ankle was publicly described as a precautionary rest. He played 6 matches in the following season, none at full intensity, before the joint's structural instability produced a secondary injury, a compensatory stress fracture in the 5th metatarsal, the kind that happens when a body has been redistributing load for too long. He had surgery. The surgery went well, technically. He attempted a return to competitive football 8 months post-surgery. He played 11 minutes of a preseason friendly. He retired at 31. The official statement from the Federation cited a persistent ankle condition. There was no further comment. The medical records from the 1994 World Cup tournament, specifically the scan from the Boston training session and the treatment logs from the following 3 weeks, were not included in the documentation transferred to his club. I know this because the club's medical director called me, privately, 6 months after the retirement announcement. He asked me if I knew anything about a pre-tournament injury. I told him I didn't have access to those records. I've thought about that phone call almost every week since it happened. I've thought about the head of the medical team and his word, manage, and what it tells you about the distance between institutional language and human consequence. I've thought about the injections I administered. I've thought about the scan I presented at 7 in the morning to a man who had already made his decision. I've thought about him lying on the treatment table, staring at the ceiling, saying fine in that way that meant nothing and everything. He was 31 years old when he stopped playing football. I don't know what it cost him to play that final. I mean that precisely. I don't know. I have the medical facts. I don't have the interior account. He never spoke publicly about the ankle, not once, not in any interview I've ever been able to find. He has a life now, outside football, and I've chosen to respect his silence in the only way available to me, which is to maintain my own. Until now, I'm 67 years old. I've worked in sports medicine for 4 decades. I've treated hundreds of athletes and I've made thousands of decisions, and most of them I can defend, if I need to. The Rose Bowl tunnel, July 17, 1994. The jaw that locked when the ankle rotation hit a certain angle. That one I carry differently. I don't know if what we did to him was wrong in a way that can be adjudicated. I don't know if the word wrong even applies cleanly to a situation where every person in the room, including him, made a choice with full information. He knew, he always knew, he chose to play, but he was 31 when he stopped, and I taped the ankle. We sold Malik's motorbike first. That was the moment I should have understood what kind of trip this was going to be. Not an adventure, not the experience of a lifetime the way we'd been calling it for 8 months, but something else entirely. Something that didn't have a clean name yet because we were still too excited to let ourselves find one. Malik didn't hesitate when we counted the shortfall. He just nodded, pulled out his phone, and listed the bike that same evening. I remember thinking that's the kind of friend you go to a World Cup with. I didn't understand yet that it was also the kind of friend you watch fall apart in a hotel room in Doha while FIFA plays its anthem on television. 6 kilometers away and you have absolutely nothing to say to him. There were 6 of us. Me, Malik, Chidi, Rotimi, Femi, and Daniel, who we called Oga D because he was 38 and the oldest, and always acted like he had a plan even when he absolutely did not. We had been planning the Qatar 2022 trip for the better part of 2 years. Through the postponement conversations and the ticket ballot chaos and the accommodation prices that made grown men genuinely gasp out loud when they saw the numbers. We were from Lagos, not all born there, but Lagos men in the way that matters, which is that the city had shaped us into people who believed that if you wanted something badly enough and worked the angles right, you could make it happen. 6 Nigerian men who had spent 2 years convincing themselves and each other that we were going to Qatar to watch Nigeria at the World Cup. Nigeria did not qualify for the 2022 World Cup. I want you to let that sit for a moment before I continue, because the way I've just stated it, clean and flat like a fact in a newspaper, does not capture what it felt like to be inside our WhatsApp group on that night in March when it became official. We had beaten Ghana in the first leg. We had traveled to Abuja for the second leg in a convoy, flags on every car, singing the kind of songs you only sing when you're already certain of the ending. And then the match happened the way it happened, and Ghana went through on away goals, and the group went silent in a way that a WhatsApp group of 6 men who have never once in 4 years been silent for more than 11 minutes had never gone silent before. I counted. We were quiet for 47 minutes. Then Ogadi typed, "We still go." Nobody responded for another 20 minutes. Then Malik typed, "We still go." Then one by one over the following hour, the rest of us typed it. "We still go." It became the thing we said instead of examining what we actually meant, which was that we had already sold things and made promises and told stories at family dinners and work meetings in church, and we had built this trip into something so large inside our lives that not going had become genuinely unthinkable, regardless of whether the central reason for going still existed. We arrived in Doha on November 19th, 2022, the day before the tournament opened. The city was extraordinary in the specific way that places built very fast with very large amounts of money are extraordinary, which is to say it looked like a dream that hadn't quite figured out how to feel real yet. Everything was new. Everything was clean. Everything was expensive in a way that started making my chest tight approximately 40 minutes after we landed. We had budgeted carefully, or we believed we had budgeted carefully, which turned out to be a different thing entirely once we were actually inside the economy of that tournament. Our accommodation was a 40-minute drive from the city center, a decision that had looked reasonable on a map in Lagos and felt catastrophic once we understood what the transportation situation actually was. The first week's transport costs alone consumed a portion of the budget we had allocated for the entire second week. Chidi did the recalculation on his phone on the third evening and showed the screen to Ogadi, and I watched Ogadi's face do something I had never seen it do in 15 years of friendship, which was go completely blank. Here is the thing about watching football at a World Cup when your country is not in the World Cup. You are a tourist of other people's joy. You move through the tournament like a man walking through a party he wasn't invited to, telling himself he's having a good time because the music is good and there is food, and somewhere in the distance people are celebrating something. But the celebration is not yours, and the names on the jerseys are not your names, and when the goals go in you can appreciate them the way you appreciate a beautiful painting, intellectually, from a correct distance. And it turns out that is not why any of us had come. We had come to feel it. We had come for that specific electricity that only exists when it's your flag and your anthem and your players and your 30 years of waiting, and without that the whole thing was just sport. And we had sold Malik's motorbike to fly 8 hours to watch sport. The group started fracturing around day 9. Not dramatically. Not with an argument or a single moment you could point to. It happened the way real fractures happen, which is quietly, along lines that were probably always there, stress points that the excitement of planning had kept invisible. Femi started disappearing in the mornings. He would say he was going to find somewhere to pray and come back 2 hours later smelling of coffee and not quite meeting anyone's eyes. And after the third time, nobody asked anymore because the question felt too large and the answer felt like it might be something we weren't ready to hear. Rotimi called his wife every evening for hours, and the calls were not the happy check-in calls of a man on an adventure. They were the low, urgent calls of a man explaining something difficult. And we all gave him space and none of us talked about it. Chidi stopped eating properly. I noticed it around day 11, the way he'd order something and move it around the plate and claim he wasn't hungry. And I knew Chidi well enough to know that Chidi was always hungry. That in 20 years I had never once seen Chidi not finish a meal. And something about watching him push food around a plate in a restaurant in Doha that was costing us money we increasingly did not have made me feel something close to grief. The re-hook here is this. None of us had a return ticket with flexibility. We had bought the cheapest fixed-date flights available because flexible return tickets had cost $260 more per person. And we had decided in a group call in September that the extra cost was unnecessary because why would any of us want to leave early? We were locked in until December 10th. The tournament final was December 18th. We had booked to stay for the group stages and the round of 16 with the intention of buying onward tickets if Nigeria progressed, which was the sentence that now lived in all of our chests like a stone nobody mentioned. On day 14, Malik told us he was nearly out of money. He said it the way you say something you've been holding for days and have finally run out of the strength to keep holding. Just put it on the table in the middle of a meal and looked at the tablecloth. I had been watching it coming and had been hoping I was wrong. Ogadi said, "Don't worry, we sorted together," the way Ogadi always said things, with absolute authority and a plan that materialized later or not at all. We pooled money. We restructured the remaining days. We stopped going to matches and watched them in the accommodation instead. 6 grown men crowded around a laptop screen watching other nations' World Cups, while the actual tournament happened 6 kilometers away in stadiums. We had traveled across the world to sit inside. The last week we barely spoke, not from anger, from something more complicated than anger, a collective exhaustion that had the texture of something being grieved, though none of us would have used that word at the time. We had come for something that didn't exist anymore, and we had stayed for something we couldn't name, and the money was almost gone, and the city outside was at a permanent festival, and we were 6 men in a room waiting for a date on a calendar. We flew home on December 10th. The flight was quiet. We landed in Lagos at 6 in the morning, and the city was already moving and hot and loud in the specific way Lagos is always already moving and hot and loud. And we collected our bags and stood outside the terminal and said goodbye to each other in the way you say goodbye, when you're not sure what the goodbye is for exactly. Not for the trip, for something larger than the trip. Malik got a new motorbike 8 months later. He sent a photo to the group. Everyone responded, thumbs up, fire emoji, that's my guy. It was the most we'd spoken since December. I stared at the photo for a long time. The bike was a different color than the one he sold. Nicer, actually, newer. And I didn't know why that made it worse, but it did. He called me the night before the match. I remember because I was already asleep, and the phone woke me, and I looked at the screen and saw his name, and felt that specific irritation of a man pulled out of sleep by someone who doesn't understand time zones. And I answered with that irritation still in my voice, and he laughed at me the way he always laughed at me, the way older brothers laugh at younger brothers, from somewhere comfortable and certain. And he said, "Go back to sleep. I just wanted to hear your voice before tomorrow." I told him he was being strange. He said maybe. I told him to score a good one. He said he'd try. I went back to sleep. That was the last normal conversation I ever had with my brother. The match was June 22nd, 1994. Estadio Metropolitano Roberto Melendez, Barranquilla was where we watched it from. A group of us crowded around a television in a cousin's house. The kind of watching where everyone is loud and physical, where goals produce collisions of bodies and near misses, produce sounds you didn't know your body could make. Colombia versus the United States. We were not worried. I want to be honest about that because some people have rewritten their memory of that afternoon into something more anxious than it was, as though we sensed something. We didn't sense anything. We were Colombians watching our national team in a World Cup, and the mood in that room was celebration waiting for its moment, not dread. The dread came later. It came in a specific shape and at a specific minute of the match that I can tell you exactly because it is burned into me with the precision of a brand. 35 minutes. A cross came in from the American left side. My brother moved to intercept. The ball struck his leg at an angle I can still see when I close my eyes, changed direction completely, and went into the net. Own goal. The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something has happened that is too large to respond to immediately, when the mind needs a moment to process before the body knows what to do. And then slowly, carefully, everyone started looking at me instead of the television. Because everyone in that room understood something that I was only beginning to understand, which was that the silence outside that house was going to be a different kind of silence than the silence inside it. Colombia lost that match 2-1. The result eliminated us from the tournament. I need you to understand the specific weight of that elimination in that country at that moment. Because if you don't understand it, none of what follows makes sense. The 1994 Colombia squad had been described by no less than Pelé himself as a potential World Cup winner. The expectations were not modest national pride. They were absolute certainty, the kind that builds in a country over months of qualifying and hype until it calcifies into something that can't absorb disappointment without cracking. When Colombia went out, something cracked. And in the very specific and brutal mathematics of that moment, there was a face attached to the exit. There was a leg, there was a deflection, there was a name. The calls started the same night of the match. Not to the Federation offices, not to the team hotel, not to addresses that would have required some effort to locate. To our family. To numbers that only people who knew us had. I don't know how they got them, and I stopped trying to understand that a long time ago. Because the how is less important than the fact, which is that before the day was over, the phone in our family home had rung with voices that said things I will not repeat here, because some language doesn't deserve to be repeated, it deserves only to be buried. My mother stopped answering the phone on the second day. My father sat in a chair by the window and aged in a way I had never seen a man age in real time, something leaving his face that didn't come back. I was 24 years old and I didn't know what to do with my hands. He flew home on July 2nd. I went to meet him, and what I remember most from that moment is not what I expected to remember. I had been preparing myself for the image of a broken man, for visible grief, for the face of someone who has been carrying public hatred for 10 days. What I saw was my brother, tired, yes, quieter than usual, but still him, still with that quality he had of taking up space in a room not through volume but through some kind of gravitational calm. He embraced my mother for a long time. He sat with my father, and they talked in low voices, and I stayed in the other room and gave them that. He ate dinner with us. He was gentle with everyone in that specific way. People are gentle when they understand that the people around them are frightened and they are trying not to add to the weight. That night he told me he wanted to speak at a school, that he was going to do some work in the community, that he had been thinking about what he wanted to do with the time ahead of him. He talked about it the way you talk about plans, with forward momentum, with the assumption of future. He was killed 8 days later. I'm not going to describe what happened in detail. Other people have described it in detail, and those descriptions exist if you need them, and I have read all of them over the years, and they have never given me anything except the specific torture of precision applied to something that should have remained unspoken. What I will tell you is where I was. I was at a friend's house, 2 streets away, and someone came to the door and said my name in a tone of voice that I had never heard directed at me before and haven't heard since. A tone that exists only in the moments when someone has to deliver news that will divide a life into before and after. I knew before they finished the sentence. I don't know how I knew. I just did. The body sometimes understands things before the mind gives it permission. The rehook is this, and I need you to stay with me here, because this is the part that people don't talk about, that gets lost in the mythology of the crime and the anger and the global conversation about football and violence. In the days between his return and his death, my brother received messages from around the world, not threats. The other kind. People from countries he had never visited writing to say they had watched him play, and he had given them joy. And the own goal was an accident, and they were sorry for what their tournament had done to his country's expectations. He read all of them. He showed me some of them. He had a particular one from a child in Japan, handwritten and scanned, and he read it more than once and kept it on the table by his bed. I found it there afterward. I still have it. I have never had it translated because I think I need one thing from those days to remain a mystery, one thing where I get to decide what it says. What I want people to understand 30 years later, sitting here in this city that has changed and stayed the same in all the ways cities do, is that the own goal was not the story. The own goal was 35 minutes of a football match. My brother was 35 years of a life. He was a man who called his younger brother the night before a match just to hear his voice. He was a man who came home from the worst professional moment of his life and talked about schools and communities and the future. He was a man who kept a handwritten letter from a child in Japan on the table by his bed. The football world made him a symbol of what can go wrong when sport and passion and the worst of human nature collide, and that symbol is real, and that conversation is necessary. And I don't begrudge the world its horror at what happened. But a symbol is a flat thing, and my brother was not flat. He was the most three-dimensional person I have ever known, and I have spent 30 years trying to hold that dimensionality against the flattening pressure of how his story gets told. I still watch football. People ask me that sometimes, as though not watching would be the logical conclusion of what happened to our family. I still watch because he loved it. He loved it with a completeness and a joy that I think very few people are lucky enough to feel about anything in their lives, and the thing that took him was not football. Football didn't pull a trigger. I refused to give football that. What took him was something that existed in Colombia at that time that used football as its excuse, and that something has other names, and those names are the ones that deserved the weight of the world's horror. Not the game he gave his life to playing. He called me the night before the match just to hear my voice. I told him to score a good one. He said he'd try. I have thought about that word try for 30 years. The smallness of it, the honesty of it, the way it contains inside itself, the acknowledgement that outcomes are not guaranteed, and effort is the only thing you can actually promise. He tried. He gave everything he had to that shirt and that country and that tournament. And the country repaid him in a way that I have made my peace with, in the way you make peace with things that are too large to defeat, which is not by forgiving them, but by refusing to let them be the last word. My brother is not the own goal. My brother is the phone call the night before. He is the letter from the child in Japan. He is the way he laughed at me when I answered with sleep still in my voice. That is what I have. That is what I keep. And nobody, not the men who came for him, and not the 30 years of mythology that followed, has ever managed to take that from me. I translated my first lie on a Tuesday morning in June 1978, and I didn't know it was a lie until 3 weeks later, when a man I had spoken to through a glass partition disappeared and never came back. That is where this story begins. Not with the football, not with the stadiums, not with the flags and the anthems and the television cameras that showed the world a country celebrating, while underneath the celebration, something else entirely was happening. It begins with a glass partition and a man on the other side of it and words passing through me from one language into another, and the moment I understood that language, in the wrong hands, in the wrong building, at the wrong moment in history, is not a bridge between people. It is a weapon, and I had been handing it to people who knew exactly how to use it. I was 26 years old when I was recruited to work as a linguistic interpreter for the 1978 FIFA World Cup in Argentina. My Spanish was native, my English was academic but strong, my French was functional, and I had some German from 2 years of university study that turned out to be more useful than I expected. I had been working as a translator for a government ministry for 14 months, junior work mostly, document translation, nothing that required real-time interpretation under pressure. The World Cup assignment felt like elevation. It was presented to me as an honor, which is a word governments use when they want you to feel grateful rather than curious. I was 26 and I felt grateful. I packed a good suit and took a bus to Buenos Aires and reported to an administrative office in a building I was told was connected to the tournament coordination committee, and I believed this completely because I was 26 and I had been raised to believe that official buildings contained official purposes and that the distance between what a government said it was doing and what it was actually doing was a matter of degree rather than kind. I was, in the specific way that only the young can be, completely wrong about almost everything. The World Cup that year was extraordinary in the way that all World Cups are extraordinary, which is to say, it was loud and colorful and emotionally overwhelming, and generated the specific kind of collective joy that makes you feel, briefly and powerfully, that human beings are capable of transcending their worst impulses. Argentina won. Mario Kempes scored twice in the final against the Netherlands, and the confetti came down in the Estadio Monumental, and 71,000 people experienced something that looked, from the outside, like pure happiness. I was inside the stadium for the final. I remember the confetti very specifically because some of it landed on the sleeve of my good suit and I brushed it off, and then immediately wished I hadn't, as though the gesture contained something I didn't want to examine. What I was doing in the 3 weeks before that final is the part I need to tell you carefully. My work was divided between 2 locations. The first was the official interpretation suite attached to the tournament's international media and diplomatic coordination office, where I translated press materials, FIFA communications, and occasional conversations between federation officials and international guests. This work was exactly what I had been told it would be. Standard, professional, occasionally tedious. The second location was a different building. I was taken there for the first time on the 4th day of the tournament by a man I knew only by a surname, who drove me in a car with no markings and told me during the drive that the work here was sensitive and required discretion, and that discretion was a condition of my continued participation in the tournament assignment. He said this pleasantly, The way you say something that contains a threat when you want the threat to function without being acknowledged as one. I nodded. I was 26. The building had a basement. I am going to be precise about this because precision is the only thing I have left to offer after 46 years. The basement had a corridor. The corridor had rooms off it. I was never taken into these rooms. I worked in an office at the end of the corridor that had a desk and 2 chairs, and a telephone and a glass partition through which I could see, in the adjacent space, whoever I was required to interpret for. The people on the other side of the partition were not FIFA officials. They were not journalists. They were not international guests requiring translation services at a football tournament. They were people who had the specific quality of people who have been in a confined space for longer than they expected and are no longer certain about what comes next. I understood this immediately and then spent considerable energy not understanding it, which is a cognitive skill that I developed with great efficiency during those 3 weeks and have never entirely lost. The re-hook here is the thing I have never said publicly in 46 years, and I am saying it now because the men who ran that building are either dead or beyond accountability, and because silence, I have learned very slowly and at great personal cost, is not neutrality. It is participation. What I translated in that basement was not diplomatic communication. It was interrogation. Structured, patient, methodical interrogation of people who were asked questions about names and addresses and organizational affiliations and meeting locations, and I sat on my side of the glass partition and turned their answers from Spanish into English for men who wrote things down in notebooks and asked follow-up questions with the focused neutrality of people performing a professional function they had performed many times before. I told myself, in the specific moral language available to a 26-year-old who needed to keep telling himself something, that I was not responsible for the questions, that I was responsible only for the accuracy of the transmission, that a translator is a conduit, not an agent, that the words were not mine. I told myself this with great conviction and increasing desperation across 3 weeks, and I became very good at believing it between sessions and then slightly less good at believing it in the car, on the way back to my accommodation, and completely unable to believe it at 3 in the morning, when the belief was most urgently required. The man behind the glass on the Tuesday in June was perhaps 40 years old. He had the hands of someone who worked physically, broad and calloused, and he held them flat on the table in front of him, with the deliberate stillness of someone who has decided that stillness is the safest available posture. He answered the questions carefully, not evasively, carefully. There is a difference. Evasion has a shape you can see. What he did was answer with the minimum information required to constitute an answer, with the precision of a man conserving something. I translated everything he said with the accuracy I had been trained to provide. At the end of the session, the men with the notebooks left the room on his side of the partition. He remained. He looked at the glass partition for a moment, and I don't know whether he could see me through it or whether it functioned as a mirror from his side. I have thought about this for 46 years, and I still don't know. He looked at the glass, and then he looked down at his hands on the table. Then they came back and took him out. I went back to my desk and wrote up my session notes, and that evening I went back to my accommodation and watched highlights of that day's World Cup matches on the television, and Argentina had won, and the streets outside were noise and color, and I sat inside and watched the television and didn't go out. 3 weeks later, I was back at my regular assignment, the official interpretation suite, the press materials and FIFA communications, and I asked the man who drove me, carefully and with the lightness of someone asking something inconsequential, what had happened with the other assignment. He looked at me in the rearview mirror for a moment. He said those matters had been resolved. I asked about the people, specifically about the man with the broad hands who held them flat on the table. He looked at the rearview mirror again. Resolved, he said again, with a very slight emphasis on the word that told me everything, and closed the conversation permanently. I finished the tournament. I went home. I resumed my ministry work. In 1985, 7 years later, when the military government had fallen and the investigations began and the newspapers started printing names and the word desaparecidos entered the permanent vocabulary of what that period had been, I read everything. I read the testimonies and the reports and the accounts of what had happened in buildings with basements and corridors, and rooms off the corridors during those years. I read them with the particular attention of a man looking for something specific, which was the man with the broad hands. I never found him. Not in the lists of the confirmed dead, and not in the accounts of the survivors, and not in any document that has been made public in the 46 years since. He is in none of the records. He is only in my memory, sitting at a table with his hands flat in front of him, looking at a glass partition, conserving something. I have been a translator for 50 years. I have worked across 4 continents in 12 languages, and I have sat in rooms where history was being made, and I have been the mechanism through which people from different worlds understood each other, and I believe in the work. I believe language is the closest thing we have to actual human connection across the distances that separate us. I believe translation done honestly is one of the most ethical acts a person can perform. I believe all of these things completely, and I also believe that in a basement in Buenos Aires in June 1978, I handed my language to people who used it to take a man somewhere he didn't come back from. And both of these things are true simultaneously, and the space between them is where I have lived for 46 years. The confetti landed on my sleeve during the final, and I brushed it off, and I have spent 4 decades understanding that the gesture was not about confetti. I was trying to brush off something that had already gone too deep to reach. I passed every test. I want to start there because everything that came after, every letter, every hearing, every morning I woke up and read my own name in a newspaper next to words like suspected and under investigation and flagged. All of it only makes sense if you begin with that fact and hold on to it the way I had to hold on to it for 3 years, when almost everything else I believed about fairness and process and the basic dignity of being presumed innocent was being systematically removed from me, one procedural decision at a time. I passed every test. A urine sample taken on June 9, 2006. In Dortmund, Germany, at the Signal Iduna Park, 20 minutes after a group stage match, in which I played 71 minutes before being substituted. A blood sample taken the following morning at the team hotel at 7:45 by a collector I had never met who arrived with a case and a clipboard in a manner so routine it was almost calming past both of them. Clean, negative for every substance on the prohibited list. I passed, and it made no difference at all. Let me tell you what the notification looks like when it comes. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive in the way your mind imagines official accusation arrives, with weight and ceremony and the decency of confrontation. It came to my national federation first, and then to me in the form of a letter in an envelope that looked like administrative correspondence, the kind you open with mild curiosity rather than dread. The header was official. The language was precise in the way that institutional language is precise. Each word chosen not for clarity but for legal defensibility, so that the sentences communicated what they needed to communicate while maintaining a perfect deniability about what they were actually saying. What they were actually saying was this: a sample associated with your athlete registration code has produced an analytical finding that requires further investigation. Further investigation. I read those 2 words 6 times standing in the corridor of the team hotel, and each time they meant something slightly different, and all of the meanings were bad. The sample in question was not the sample I had given on June 9th. This is the detail that took me 4 months to fully understand, because the process was not designed to be understood quickly. It was a sample given during a pre-tournament screening in April, 2 months before the World Cup began, at a domestic league match, a screening that I had also passed at the time. What the anti-doping authority was now claiming was that on reanalysis, using a testing methodology that had been updated between April and June, a metabolite had been detected in that April sample that fell within the threshold of a substance that had been added to the prohibited list in January of that year. A substance I had never heard of, a substance that, when I eventually had it explained to me by a pharmacologist my lawyer hired, was present in a supplement I had been taking legally since the previous autumn, a supplement that dozens of professional athletes across multiple sports used routinely, a supplement that had been tested and certified clean by the manufacturer and was sold openly in every sports nutrition store in my country. The substance it apparently contained had been added to the prohibited list 4 months after I began taking it. The re-hook here is the thing that broke something in me in a way that the original notification didn't. I was still in Germany when the Federation told me I was being provisionally suspended from the tournament pending investigation. Provisionally. Another word chosen for its legal function rather than its human meaning. What provisional meant in practice was that I was removed from the squad without public explanation 3 days before our round of 16 match. The official communication to the press described it as a personal matter. A personal matter. I sat in a hotel room in Germany and watched my teammates prepare for a match I had trained for across 4 years of my career, and I was a personal matter. My family was watching from home, and they didn't know what was happening because I hadn't told them yet, because I didn't know how to tell them something I didn't fully understand myself. My mother called me that evening to ask why I wasn't on the team sheet. I told her I had a minor injury. I told my mother I had a minor injury. I am not someone who lies to his mother. I have never lied to my mother in my adult life. That is what the process did to me before it had been running for a week. The investigation took 7 months. 7 months during which I was technically under sanction, which meant I could not play competitive football, which meant the club season that began in August proceeded without me while my club, who had paid a significant transfer fee for me the previous summer, waited with the specific patience of organizations that are calculating costs. My legal representation cost money I didn't have in the quantities required, and sports lawyers who specialize in anti-doping cases are not inexpensive people. And my contract had clauses that the club's legal team began referencing in conversations with my agent, that my agent relayed to me in calls that became shorter and more careful as the months went on. I sold my car in October, not because I needed the specific money from the car, but because I needed to feel like I was doing something active in a situation where almost everything was happening to me rather than being done by me, and selling the car was something I could control when nothing else was. The hearings were held in a building that had the quality of a place designed to make you feel small. Not deliberately hostile, which would have been easier to resist, but bureaucratically indifferent in a way that was somehow worse. Long tables, many folders, people who addressed me through my lawyer rather than to me directly, as though I was a case rather than a person, which I understood was legally appropriate, and which made me want to put my head through the long table, approximately once every 20 minutes. The anti-doping authority's representative was professional and thorough, and not unkind, which I found disorienting because I had come prepared for an adversary and instead encountered a process. And a process is much harder to argue with than a person because it has no face and no conscience and no capacity to recognize the distinction between technical guilt and actual wrongdoing. What they were doing, I came to understand through 7 months of legal education I had not asked for, was applying strict liability. In anti-doping law, strict liability means that the presence of a prohibited substances sample constitutes violation regardless of intent, regardless of knowledge, regardless of whether the substance entered your body through negligence or accident, or a certification failure by a manufacturer you had every reasonable basis to trust. The question of whether I intended to cheat was, under strict liability, legally irrelevant. The question of whether I knew I was taking a prohibited substance was legally irrelevant. The only legally relevant question was whether the substance was there. It was there. Therefore, I had committed a violation. This is the logic. I have repeated it to myself thousands of times, and it has never once felt like justice, and it has never once felt like something I could argue my way out of. And the combination of those two feelings living in the same body for 7 months is something I don't have adequate language for. The finding in November was a reduced sanction. 12 months, backdated to the provisional suspension in June, meaning I had effectively served most of it already. No finding of intentional doping, no finding of negligence on my part. An acknowledgement in the written decision that the supplement manufacturer's certification had been inadequate and that I had taken reasonable steps to ensure compliance. A reduced sanction, in other words, that acknowledged I had done nothing wrong while simultaneously confirming that I had committed a violation. I read this decision in my lawyer's office and he told me it was the best possible outcome. And I looked at him and I said, 12 months for something I didn't do is the best possible outcome. And he said, yes. In this system, yes it is. And I understood that he was being honest with me. And I understood that his honesty was the most depressing thing anyone had said to me in 7 months, which was a very competitive field. I returned to football in the following season. I played well enough. My club honored the contract, technically, though the relationship had the quality of something repaired rather than unbroken. And there is a difference between those two things that you feel in every training session and every team meeting and every conversation with a coach who is looking at you with an assessment that includes information you didn't put there. I played for 3 more years at club level. I was never recalled to the national team. The Federation never explained this publicly. I never asked for an explanation because I understood that asking would produce an answer in the careful institutional language I had learned to read during those 7 months. And that answer would mean no without saying no. And I had already spent enough of my life parsing language for the thing it was trying not to say. I am 39 years old now. I coach youth players at an academy in my home city. On the first day of every new intake, I tell the players one thing before we discuss anything about football. I tell them to read every label. I tell them to photograph every supplement and send it to a certified nutritionist before they put it in their body. I tell them that the system that governs their sport was not designed with them in mind and that this is not a reason for cynicism, but it is a reason for precision. I tell them that fairness and process are not the same thing, and that understanding the difference early will cost them less than learning it the way I learned it. They listen with the polite attention of young people who believe, in the specific and necessary way that young people must believe in order to keep going, that these things happen to other people. I was 28 years old in a hotel room in Germany, and I believed the same thing. I passed every test. It made no difference at all. And I would give anything, I would give every remaining year of my career back without a moment's hesitation, to have never had to learn what that sentence actually means. The first thing they gave me was an envelope. Not money inside, just a number. A phone number written in blue ink on white paper folded once. The man who handed it to me wore a yellow polo shirt and smelled like airport cologne, and he did it the way you pass someone a business card, casually, like it meant nothing, like we were two professionals exchanging contact information at a conference. He said my son's name. He said it the way people say the names of children they've never met, carefully, like they've rehearsed it. He said he hoped the boy was feeling better. That was the first thing. I need you to understand what I was before that envelope. I carried shirts. I counted boots. I laid out shin guards in a row on a training ground outside of Johannesburg at 5:30 in the morning when the grass was wet and the sky was the color of a bruise going yellow. I had done this for 11 years for the national program. Before that, I had done it for a provincial side. Before that, I had done it for nothing, for a youth academy in my neighborhood where the kit was so old the numbers had cracked off the backs and the boys had to write their own in permanent marker before matches. I knew this work. I knew how to pack a bag so that nothing shifted in transit, how to get grass stains out of white shorts, how to keep 32 sets of equipment organized across 6 training sessions a week, how to stay invisible in the corners of a room full of famous men and not feel reduced by it. I was good at my job. That was the sum of my life in football. My son had been sick for 2 years. Not dramatically, not terminally, just the grinding kind of sick that costs money every month without ever fully resolving. Medication, appointments, a specialist who required a referral that required a different specialist. His mother and I had made a system out of it. We had become experts in the bureaucracy of keeping a child unwell from becoming a child critically unwell. I had savings. Then I had less savings. Then I had a number written on a white piece of paper. I didn't call it. Not the first week. The tournament had started the way every tournament I'd ever worked started, with chaos that resolved itself into routine. The same argument about boot sizes. The same player who always lost his shin guards and always blamed someone else. The luggage that arrived without one bag. The bag that eventually appeared in a hallway at the hotel. Nobody knowing how. I knew this chaos. I controlled it. In the corridor outside the team's dressing room, I was the calmest person in the building. The man in the yellow polo shirt found me again on the 9th day. I was moving equipment from the bus to the hotel. He helped me with a box. He didn't say anything about the number. He talked about the weather, about how impressive the stadium was, about how he hoped the team was finding their rhythm. Then as he walked away, he said, "You have a few more days to decide, and it would be better for everyone if you did." I went to my room that night, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I called my wife. She told me our son had started a new medication and that the doctor was cautiously optimistic, which meant it was expensive and uncertain. She asked how the tournament was going. I said it was going well. She said she was proud of me, that she watched every match even when our team wasn't playing, that she told their son his father was there, right there, on the inside. I called the number the next morning. What they wanted was not complicated. They needed someone inside the team's inner circle. Not a player, not a coach, not a doctor. Someone whose presence would not be questioned. Someone who moved through spaces without being watched. They needed a message delivered to a specific player. They needed confirmation that it had been received and understood. That was all. Just a message. Just a confirmation. The actual act, whatever happened on the pitch, was not my responsibility. I want to be honest about what I did with that logic. I used it. I took it and I held it carefully the way you hold something fragile. And I carried it around with me for 3 days before the match. And every time it started to crack, I found a way to reinforce it. I was just a courier. I had no power over what anyone chose to do. A man makes his own decisions. I was just delivering a piece of paper, folded once. The player was young, 23, 24. He had a way of sitting in a corner of the dressing room with headphones in, not listening to music, just blocking everything out. I had watched him do this before every match for 2 years. I knew his habits the way you know the habits of someone you've worked around without ever really speaking to. The slight twitch in his left knee, before he put on his boots, the way he always taped his wrists even though he'd never had a wrist injury, the expression on his face when he was frightened that looked almost identical to the expression on his face when he was focused. I knew these things and I used them too. I handed him the message when no one was looking. He read it. He looked at me once, not with anger, not with confusion, just with something flat and exhausted, like a door closing, and he folded it into his shirt pocket. I went back to counting boots. I have thought about that look every day since. I have constructed entire conversations in my head, whole arguments about what it meant. Maybe he had already been contacted separately, and I was simply confirming something he'd already agreed to. Maybe the message meant nothing to him. Maybe he threw it in a bin somewhere and played exactly as he would have played anyway. Maybe the outcome of that match had nothing to do with anything I did. The final score was not extraordinary. The performance was not visibly degraded. No one pointed at any moment and said, "There, that was it." But I know what I did. I know what I was part of. And the distance between doing a thing and being responsible for a thing, I thought that distance would feel like relief. And it doesn't. It has never felt like anything except smaller and smaller the longer I hold it. My son is 12 now. He is healthy. The medication worked. He plays football on Saturdays in a kit with numbers cracked off the back. And he doesn't know why his father sometimes watches him from the sideline, with an expression that his mother has learned not to ask about. I never heard from the man in the yellow polo shirt again. The player retired 3 years later due to injury. The syndicate, I assume, moved on to other tournaments, other envelopes, other men with sick children and savings accounts running dry. I still pack the bags. I still lay out the shin guards in a row before training. I am still good at my job, and I am still invisible in the corners of rooms full of famous men, and I carry this the way I carry everything, efficiently, without showing the weight. The match was 11 years ago. Some nights it feels like it happened to someone else. Most nights it doesn't. I taught him how to breathe before a match. Not metaphorically, literally. He was 13 years old, and he would hyperventilate in the tunnel before every game. This shallow, rapid breathing that started in his chest and worked its way up into his throat. And I used to stand beside him with my hand on his sternum and say, "Slower from here, push against my hand," and he would. Within 30 seconds, he would regulate. Within a minute, he would be calm. He used to look at me afterward like I had performed a small miracle, and I never told him that it wasn't a miracle, that it was just physiology, that the body can be coached out of panic the same way it can be coached into a tackle or a first touch. I let him believe it was something between us. Maybe it was. I watched him walk out in front of 62,000 people at the 2002 World Cup, and understood, for the first time in 20 years of coaching, that there are things you cannot prepare a child for. You can give them everything. You can spend a decade building the architecture of a human being, their confidence, their reading of the game, their ability to stay present under pressure. And then a thing can arrive that is simply bigger than the architecture. That is not a coaching failure. I know that now. I did not know it then. He came to me when he was 12, referred by a primary school teacher who had watched him play in a concrete yard and written a note that said, "This one is different." I had received notes like that before. Most of them were wrong. This one was not wrong. He had the thing that you cannot teach and cannot manufacture, that quality of attention, of being completely inside a moment, that the best players carry like a second skeleton. His technique needed work. His positioning needed work. Everything that could be coached needed work. The thing that couldn't be coached was already perfect. I worked with him for 6 years. I watched him grow from a small, nervous boy who hyperventilated in tunnels into a young man who moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who has been told repeatedly and credibly that they are exceptional. I told him that I am not ashamed of it. Some coaches withhold praise as a motivational strategy. I never believed in that. I believed in building something real in a person and then trusting what you built. His family came to every match. His father stood in the same spot on the left side of every railing he could find, arms folded, face unreadable. And I learned over 6 years that the unreadable face meant pride so large he had no expression for it. His mother brought food after training sessions sometimes. Containers she pressed into my hands without much ceremony, like it was a practical exchange, like she was simply paying rent on the time I spent with her son. I ate whatever was in those containers at my desk at the end of the day, and I thought, this is what the job is at its best. This is the whole of it. He was selected for the senior national squad at 21. I was not his coach anymore, hadn't been for 5 years. But his father called me the night the squad was announced, and I could hear the man crying on the other end of the phone, this quiet, controlled crying that sounded like it was happening behind his hand, like he was trying not to let me hear it and couldn't stop it. I got a credential to attend 2 matches at the 2002 tournament. I used connections I had built over 2 decades to get into the stadium as an accredited coach observer, which meant I sat in a section with other coaches and analysts and watched the matches from a distance that felt, at certain moments, like the distance between 2 countries. The first match I attended, he played well. Not brilliantly, but solidly. The composed, present quality that had always been his foundation was visible in his positioning, in his decisions under pressure. I watched him, and I felt the specific pride of someone who knows that what they're watching is partly their own work, expressed through another person's body. It is a strange feeling. It doesn't belong entirely to you, and you know that, and the knowing doesn't diminish it. Between that match and the second one, something happened that I was not inside and could not control. The team had drawn a match they were expected to win. The press, and I want to be precise about this because precision matters, the press did not turn on the team. They turned on one player. They selected him with a specificity that still disturbs me when I think about it. A focused intensity that transformed one young man into the physical container for an entire nation's anxiety. The coverage was not analytical. It did not concern itself with positioning or tactical decisions or the complexity of playing under a particular system. It concerned itself with whether he was sufficiently invested, sufficiently hungry, sufficiently Korean. It asked, in the way that press learns to ask things without asking them directly, whether he truly wanted this the way the nation needed him to want it. He was 22 years old. He had wanted this since he was 12 years old. He had wanted it so badly that he used to hyperventilate indoors thinking about it. I was not with him. I want to be very clear about that because it is the part I return to most often. I was not in the hotel, not in the training sessions, not in the corridors where he was moving through that week. I was a youth academy coach with an observer credential, sitting in a stadium section, watching from a distance that had become, without my realizing it, absolute. The second match I attended, I watched him disappear, not physically. He was on the pitch for the full 90 minutes. But the player I had built, the one who breathed slowly and pushed against my hand and moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who understood their own quality, that player was not on the pitch. What was on the pitch was a young man who had been told by 60 million people that he was not enough and who had believed them. You could see it in everything. In the half-second of hesitation before decisions that should have been automatic. In the eyes, and I was far away, I was in an observer's seat with a view that was technically excellent but humanly insufficient. But even from that distance I recognized the eyes. I had seen those eyes before, in a tunnel, in a 12-year-old boy who could not breathe. I had no way to reach him. I have never felt more useless in my professional life than I did in those 90 minutes. I had the specific, excruciating experience of watching something break that I had spent years making strong, and understanding that the break was not happening because the thing wasn't strong. It was happening because the force applied to it was simply not a force I had ever prepared him for. I had prepared him for football. I had not prepared him for being turned into a symbol by a nation and then found wanting. After the match, I went back to my hotel room and I sat with the lights off for a long time. The coverage the following day was worse than the coverage before the match. It is the nature of that kind of attention. It feeds on confirmation, and the performance had confirmed what it had already decided. The narrative was already written. He became the player who had failed at the moment his country needed him most. That sentence, in various forms, followed him for years. He did not reach the level that his talent warranted. I do not think that is a controversial statement. I think anyone who watched him at 16, at 18, at 21, would agree that what he became was smaller than what he was. Whether that is because of those 2 weeks in 2002, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that the player who came out of that tournament was not the player who went in, and the difference was not physical, not technical, and not tactical. I have coached many players since. I have sent 3 into professional football, 1 into a national squad at a later cycle, several into the kind of quiet, competent careers that sustain lower leagues and give families something to be proud of. I am good at this work. I believe in it. But I think about what I would do differently. Not with the press, not with the tournament, not with the forces that are simply larger than any individual coach's architecture. I know I couldn't control those. I think about the 6 years I had with him. I think about what I taught him and what I didn't. I taught him how to breathe. I taught him positioning and first touch and how to read a defensive line. I taught him to trust the thing inside him that I recognized as exceptional and told him was real. I don't know if I taught him what to do when 60 million people told him it wasn't. Maybe that's not a coachable thing. Maybe some weights are just too heavy, regardless of how long you spent in the gym. I have colleagues who would tell me that, and I would tell them they're right, and I would believe it intellectually. And then at 3 in the morning I would lie there and rebuild every session, every conversation, every moment in a tunnel with my hand on a boy's sternum. And I would ask myself, was there a version of those 6 years that ended differently? I don't have an answer. I'm not sure there is one. His father stopped calling me after 2002. Not angrily, he just stopped. I think it was too much to hold, the connection between me and the thing he had watched his son become and then not become. I understood it. I didn't blame him. I still have the note from the primary school teacher. I kept it. It is in a folder in my desk drawer along with other documents from that period. Training, records, development assessments, the administrative paper of a child becoming a footballer. I don't read it often, but I know what it says. This one is different. He was. That's the thing I need you to understand, the thing I need to say out loud even now, even after everything. He was different. What happened to him was not a revelation of ordinariness. It was not the world correctly identifying someone who had been overpraised. What happened to him was something being broken that was genuinely worth protecting. And I was the person whose job it was to protect it, and I was sitting in an observer's section 200 meters away, and I could not reach him. That is what I carry. That is the whole of it. I knew I was going to miss it before I walked out of the tunnel. Not a feeling, not nerves, not superstition, not the ordinary dread that every goalkeeper carries into a penalty shootout like a stone in the chest. I mean, I knew, with the flat, clinical certainty of someone reading a result that has already been printed, that when my turn came, I would fail. I had known it for 11 days. I had been living inside that knowledge for 11 days, carrying it through training sessions and team meals and the particular performance of composure that I had perfected over 14 years as a professional, and nobody saw it, and I said nothing, and I walked out anyway. That is the part I need to explain. Not the miss. Everyone knows about the miss. The miss lasted 3 seconds and has been replayed 10,000 times and exists now as a kind of permanent public property, a moment that belongs to everyone who watched it and to me simultaneously, which means it belongs to no one cleanly. I am not here to talk about the miss. I am here to talk about the 11 days before it, and what was happening inside me during those 11 days, and why I said nothing, and what I understand now that I did not have language for then. It started, or I should say, it became undeniable, on the flight to France. It had existed before that. Looking back from where I stand now with the vocabulary I have now, I can trace it further, years further, maybe to my early 20s, maybe earlier. This pattern of weeks where something in the mechanism shifted and the thoughts came differently. Not faster exactly, but louder, with a quality of certainty that my normal thoughts didn't have. Intrusive is the clinical word. They arrived without invitation and they stayed without permission, and the content of them always was failure. Specific, detailed, fully rendered failure. I would be driving to training and I would see, with complete visual clarity, myself dropping across. I would be eating dinner and the image would arrive, a shot going through my hands. It had always passed within a few days. I had never spoken about it because I had no framework for it, no language, no understanding that it was a thing with a name rather than simply a defect in my character that I needed to manage privately. On the flight to France, it did not pass. By the third day of the tournament, I had not slept more than 3 hours in any single night. Not insomnia in the ordinary sense. I would lie down and my body would be exhausted and my mind would begin. It would run simulations. It would construct in extraordinary detail every possible way a match could go wrong specifically because of me. Not the team, me. Always specifically me. Always the moment when the ball moved through the space I was responsible for, and I was simply not adequate to it. I watched these simulations the way you watch something on a screen, with a horrible passive clarity, unable to change the channel. I developed rituals. This is the part that embarrasses me most, not because the rituals were strange. They were not particularly strange by goalkeeper standards, and goalkeepers are a population that tolerates ritual. But because I knew, even as I was building them, that they were not protective. I knew they were the behavior of a frightened mind trying to impose structure on something structureless. I touched the left post before every session. I retaped my gloves in a specific sequence. I stood in the same spot during the national anthem, weight distributed in exactly the same way, right heel slightly raised. These things took on enormous significance. If I completed them correctly, I experienced approximately 4 minutes of relief before the dread returned in full. I was performing the entire time. That is what nobody understood, and what I could not explain, and what I want to be precise about now. I was giving the performance of my professional life during those weeks. In training, I was technically excellent. My distribution was clean. My organization of the defensive line was sharp. My communication was controlled and authoritative. I was a good goalkeeper, making good decisions and showing nothing. I had spent 14 years learning to show nothing, because showing something, showing fear, showing doubt, showing the interior, was understood in the culture I had grown up in as weakness so fundamental it could end a career. So I showed nothing and I was praised for my composure, and I went back to my room at night and lay in the dark running simulations until 4 in the morning. The shootout was against a side we had split 2 competitive matches with in the previous 3 years. Going into it, the analysts said the odds were roughly even. I had saved 2 penalties in competitive shootouts across my career. I had a reasonable record. There was no statistical basis for the certainty I carried. Here is what I remember from the walk from the center circle to the goal line. The grass, which was slightly longer than I preferred. The sound, which was not loud in the way people imagine. It was a kind of pressurized silence. The crowd so large that its noise became something else, became weather rather than sound. The faces of my teammates, which I did not look at. I had a specific memory of standing at my locker before the match and thinking, if I tell someone, if I say the words out loud, they will remove me. They will see that I am not fit to be here. And a second thought immediately following, but you are not fit to be here. And a third thought, the one that won. You have been here for 14 years. You know how to do this. Whatever is happening in your head is happening in your head, and the ball is the ball, and the post is the post, and those are real, and the rest is not. That is the bargain I made with myself. I saved the first 2 penalties they took. I want to say that not as consolation but as accuracy. I saved them, and in the moment of saving them I felt something close to normal, something close to the clean animal competence that the game had always given me, the way the body knows what to do when the mind is ruined and takes over with a kind of mercy. For approximately 40 seconds between each save I thought, maybe I was wrong. Maybe the thing in my head is not prophetic, just fearful. And fear and prophecy are not the same thing. Then it was my turn. I walked to the spot. The walk from the goal to the penalty spot is a very particular distance, 12 yards, which takes approximately 8 steps, which is approximately 7 steps more than you need to understand that your body has departed from you. I placed the ball. I stepped back. I looked at the goalkeeper, at the man in the other goal, not at the goal itself, because that is what you are trained to do. You look at the keeper, not the target. And in the 3 seconds before my run-up, I had the following thought, completely clearly, with no ambiguity. I am going to hit this directly at him, not because I wanted to, because my body had been receiving that instruction for 11 days and had finally, in the moment of execution, simply complied. I hit it directly at him. He saved it without difficulty. He didn't even dive. The sound the crowd made was not the sound I expected. It was a kind of collective exhale, like 60,000 people releasing something they had been holding. I stood and I watched him catch the ball, and I felt, and this is the thing that has stayed with me more than any other part, I felt relief, a pure, terrible relief. Because the thing I had known was going to happen had happened, and the knowing and the happening had finally aligned, and the gap between them, that 11-day gap that I had been living inside, had closed. We lost the shootout. We were eliminated. I flew home 2 days later. I did not speak publicly about what had happened inside me. I gave the press conference that was required. I used the language that is always used. Disappointed, proud of the team, character of the group, heads held high. I said these things, and they were not exactly lies, and they were not exactly true, and nobody asked me anything that required a different kind of answer. I retired 2 years later. The reasons I gave were physical, age, a shoulder that had been managed rather than healed for 3 seasons, the honest arithmetic of a body that had been used professionally for 16 years. These things were real. They were not the whole of it. It took me 4 years after retirement to speak to anyone about what I have described here. 4 years to find the language, to find a professional who had the vocabulary for it and the patience for a man who had spent 2 decades treating his own interior as something to be suppressed rather than understood. What I was told, in careful clinical terms, was that what I had experienced was not a character defect and not a prophecy, and not the revelation of some fundamental inadequacy. It was an illness, a manageable, treatable, named illness that had been operating in me for probably 15 years before France, running its cycles quietly, mostly contained, until the pressure of a specific environment in a specific moment gave it enough oxygen to become undeniable. I think about the goalkeeper I was. I think about the 14 years of composure, the performance of stillness, the architecture of a professional identity built entirely on the premise that the interior was not relevant, that what mattered was only what the body did in the space between the posts. I was good at that architecture. I built it carefully and I maintained it, and it served me for a long time. But an architecture that has no door, no way in, no way out, no way to let another person stand inside it with you, is not a structure. It is a sealed room, and sealed rooms, given enough time and enough pressure, do not hold. I know that now. I did not know it then. And the distance between those 2 sentences is the whole story, and I have stopped pretending otherwise. The man was dying and 40,000 people were in the way, not intentionally. That is the thing I need you to understand before anything else. Because the easier version of this story, the version where there is a villain, where someone made a decision that was cruel or negligent or corrupt, that version would be cleaner and I could live with it more easily. There was no villain. There was a system, and the system was not designed for what happened, and the gap between what the system could do and what the moment required was exactly the size of a human life. I had been a stadium medic for 9 years before 2002. Club football, international friendlies, 2 major tournaments at the continental level. I knew the work. I knew the specific grammar of stadium medicine, the sprained ankles, the heat exhaustion, the lacerations that look dramatic and aren't, the cardiac events that look manageable and aren't. I had protocols. I had equipment. I had a team of 4 and a medical room beneath the south stand, and a route mapped from every section of the stadium to that room, timed and tested during the pre-tournament walkthrough the week before the first match. I had done everything correctly. I need to say that not as a defense but as a fact, because what happened was not the result of negligence, and I spent 2 years believing it was, and I need to be precise about the distinction. The call came in the 67th minute. A man in block 14, row 22 had collapsed. Cardiac event, suspected. The description from the section steward was breathless and partial, the kind of description you get from someone who has never seen this before and is operating on the outer edge of their training. Male, older, not responding, face wrong color. I took my team and we moved. Block 14 was on the opposite side of the stadium from our medical room. This was not unusual. We covered the full ground, and the route we had mapped went through the service corridor beneath the east stand, which bypassed the crowd entirely and brought us up through a steward access point approximately 30 meters from the block. We had timed this route at 4 minutes and 20 seconds during the walkthrough. 4 minutes and 20 seconds for a cardiac event is not ideal. It is within the range of survival outcomes if the patient has not been down long and if someone is performing compression in the interim. We entered the service corridor at the 67th minute and 30 seconds. The corridor was blocked, not by a locked door, not by a structural failure, by catering equipment. Trolleys, stacked and parked in the corridor in a configuration that suggested they had been placed there temporarily during halftime restocking and not fully cleared. 3 trolleys, 2 of them interlocked at an angle that was not immediately resolvable, filling approximately 2/3 of a corridor that required full width for a stretcher and a team of 4 moving with urgency. I want to describe the next 4 minutes accurately because accuracy is the only thing I can offer. We moved the first trolley in 40 seconds. It was heavy, and the wheels had partially locked, and there were 2 of us working it, and the corridor was not wide enough for leverage. And we moved it in 40 seconds, which felt like 40 minutes. The second trolley required disengaging it from the third, which meant lifting one end while the wheel mechanism was addressed, which required my strongest team member lying partially on the ground in a service corridor beneath a football stadium, while 67,000 people above us watched a match in the 68th minute. I radioed the steward in Block 14 and told him to find anyone nearby who knew CPR and to begin compressions. He told me there was a man 2 rows up who said he had done a first aid course. I told him to get that man working immediately. He told me the man was already working. I told him we were 4 minutes away. He said okay, and I could hear in the okay that he was frightened and that the okay meant nothing. The third trolley cleared at 3 minutes and 12 seconds. We moved. Here is where I need to explain something about crowds that you only understand from inside them. A crowd of 67,000 people watching a football match is not, from the inside, 67,000 individuals. It is a unified organism with its own physics. It moves in ways that are responsive to the match, not to the space around it. When we emerged from the steward access point and entered the concourse level, the match was in a passage of high pressure. I learned later that the home side had a chance on goal in the 69th minute. Nothing came of it, but the crowd was oriented entirely toward that possibility, bodies leaning forward, the lateral movement that crowds make when they're collectively straining towards something on a pitch. We were moving against that physics. I had a medical bag and a defibrillator case, and 2 team members with a folded stretcher, and we were moving laterally across a concourse that was not designed for lateral movement during a live match. People moved when they saw us. I want to be fair about this. People moved, they made space. There was no hostility and no obstruction that was intentional. But a crowd moving to make space moves the way water moves when you push through it. It closes behind you. It creates turbulence on the sides. The people who see you and step back are stepping into the people who don't see you yet. And the net effect of 60 people trying to help is sometimes geometrically equivalent to 60 people being in the way. We reached row 22 at 5 minutes and 40 seconds from the initial call. The man was on the ground between 2 rows of seats. The space between rows in that section was approximately 45 centimeters. He was a large man, heavyset, and the person performing compressions, the man from 2 rows up who had done a first aid course at some point in his life, was doing something that resembled what compression should look like without the depth or the rhythm that makes it effective. I do not say this critically. He was a civilian who had been asked to keep a stranger alive in a 45-centimeter gap between stadium seats while 40,000 people watched football above his head. He was doing everything he had. I took over compressions and my colleague prepared the defibrillator, and I was aware, in a peripheral way, of the crowd around us. Not the whole stadium, just the immediate radius. 20 or 30 people who had turned from the match and were watching, some standing on their seats, some crouching, a child near the aisle who was being held by an adult in a way that suggested the adult was deciding whether to block the view or let it happen. The defibrillator analysis took 11 seconds. It advised a shock. We shocked him. He responded. Not dramatically. He did not open his eyes and speak. He did not produce the kind of moment that gets described afterward as miraculous. His heart resumed an irregular rhythm that was survivable. His color changed slightly. He was breathing, technically. He needed a hospital within the next 20 minutes, and a hospital was 22 minutes away by the route our ambulance was cleared to take, because the tournament traffic management protocol routed emergency vehicles through a designated corridor that avoided the stadium perimeter roads. sensible in theory, longer in practice, designed for post-match dispersal rather than mid-match emergency. We got him to the medical room. We stabilized him as much as we could. The ambulance was called at the 69th minute and arrived at the 74th. He was in the hospital by the 88th minute. He survived. I want to say that clearly because this is not a story about a death. He survived, and he recovered, and I was told several months later by a tournament official who passed on the information in the same tone he might use to confirm a logistical detail, that the man had returned to normal activity and was doing well. He survived because of a combination of factors that included luck in proportions I am not comfortable with. If the catering trolleys had been cleared, if the service corridor had been the width it was designed to be, if the ambulance route had been planned for mid-match rather than post-match scenarios, if the row spacing in Block 14 had been 40 centimeters wider, if the first aid training available to the public was more thorough, if any one of these things had been different in either direction, 4 minutes and 20 seconds becomes 7 minutes, and 7 minutes is a different conversation. The official review of the incident, conducted 6 weeks after the tournament, found no procedural failures. This is technically accurate. Every individual component of the system had functioned within its designed parameters. The corridor was not designated as an emergency route, and therefore its obstruction did not constitute a protocol violation. The ambulance followed its assigned path. The stewards followed their training. I followed mine. The system worked. A man nearly died inside it. I submitted a written recommendation following the review. It was a detailed document, 11 pages, specific, costed, covering corridor clearance protocols, row spacing requirements for older stadium sections, ambulance routing alternatives, mandatory CPR training for all stadium staff above a certain threshold. I spent 3 weeks writing it. I was told it had been received and would be considered in future planning cycles. I don't know what happened to it. I still work in stadium medicine. Different tournaments, different stadiums, different countries. Before every major event, I walk the routes with my team and we time them, and I look at every corridor for obstructions, and I map every ambulance route, and I ask about row spacing, and I brief every steward in my section on CPR to a standard that is higher than what is required. I do all of this because the distance between a functional system and an adequate one is not always visible until the 67th minute. And because the man in Block 14 survived, and the fact that he survived does not mean the next one will, and I am the person who knows what the corridor looked like, and I am the person who has to live inside that knowledge, and doing the work is the only honest response to it. The match finished 2-1. I don't remember who scored. I was 11 years old and I ironed my own shirt. My mother had ironed it twice already, once the night before and once that morning, but I took it from the hanger an hour before we left, and I ironed it again myself because I wanted to be responsible for how I looked. I had been selected. Out of every boy in our neighborhood, out of every boy in the program, I had been selected to be a ball boy at the 2014 World Cup, and I understood, in the wordless way that children understand the weight of things before they have language for it, that this was the most significant day of my family's life up to that point. My mother stood in the doorway watching me iron and said nothing. The not saying anything was the loudest thing in the room. We lived in a favela on the northern edge of the city. I don't say that as context or color. I say it because it is the fact that explains everything else. The fact that my selection meant what it meant to my mother, to my uncle who took the morning off work to watch me leave, to the woman 3 houses down who came to the gate and held my face in both hands and said something to me in a low voice that I was too nervous to hear properly but understood was a blessing. In our neighborhood, being inside that stadium, not in the stands, not watching from outside, but inside, credentialed, part of the mechanism, was a thing that did not happen to people from where we were from. And it was happening to me. I was 11 years old and I had ironed my own shirt and I was going inside. The job itself was not glamorous. Nobody tells you this beforehand. You stand at designated positions around the pitch perimeter, and when the ball goes out of play, you retrieve it and return it to the nearest player as quickly as possible. There is a protocol. There is a supervisor who briefs you on the protocol with the seriousness of someone briefing a surgical team. And you nod and you remember everything and you stand at your position and the match begins, and for approximately the first 20 minutes you are so overwhelmed by the scale of the thing The noise, the light, the grass which is a color of green that does not exist anywhere else. A manufactured, pressurized green that seems to produce its own light. That the protocol becomes something you are performing on autopilot, while the rest of you simply tries to process being alive inside this particular moment. Then in the 34th minute, the ball came to me. It came fast, harder than I expected, and it hit the base of the advertising hoarding beside me and rebounded at an angle that I had not anticipated. And I went for it, and my feet went from under me on the track surface and I fell. Not dramatically, not a tumble or a roll, just a simple, clean, immediate sit-down, like a chair had been pulled from under me. I was on the ground for approximately 2 seconds. I got up, I retrieved the ball. I returned it. The match continued. In the stadium, in that moment, nothing happened. No reaction from the crowd, no acknowledgement from the players, no pause in anything. I was a ball boy who had slipped. It was a 2-second event in a 90-minute match involving some of the most famous footballers on earth. By any rational measure, it was invisible. What I did not know, what I could not have known, because I was 11 years old and the concept I needed to understand had not yet been explained to me by anyone, was that 23 cameras were filming that match from different angles, and that one of those cameras had captured my fall in a way that, when clipped and isolated and stripped of its 2-second context, looked extraordinarily funny. The way my legs went, the expression on my face, apparently, the speed of the sit-down. Someone posted it within the hour. By the time I got home that evening, still wearing the iron shirt, still carrying the credential around my neck because I had not wanted to take it off, it had been viewed 400,000 times. My uncle showed me on his phone. He was laughing, which meant he thought I should laugh too, so I laughed. My mother looked at the phone, and then at me, and then at the phone again, and her face did something complicated that I did not have the emotional vocabulary to read at 11, but can now identify as the specific expression of a person watching something they cannot stop and do not yet understand the full consequences of. By the next morning, it was everywhere, the comments, and I did not read them all. My mother tried to prevent me from reading them, but I was 11, and I knew how to use a phone, and prevention at that age is more aspiration than reality. The comments were not cruel, mostly. That is the honest account of it. Mostly they were people laughing, people tagging other people writing variations of the same 3 jokes. The cruelty was structural rather than intentional. It was the cruelty of reduction, of taking a human being and removing everything about them except the 2 seconds that were funny, and then reproducing those 2 seconds 4 million times, and then 8 million, until the 2 seconds became the whole of you in the minds of people who had never thought about you before, and would not think about you again after. The next funny thing arrived. I became, in the taxonomy of internet objects, a meme. When school resumed, I understood immediately that something had changed in the way I occupied space. It was not bullying in the traditional sense. Nobody hit me, nobody organized against me, nobody conducted a sustained campaign. It was subtler, and in some ways harder to address because it had no clear perpetrator. It was the boy in the year above who did the fall whenever he passed me in the corridor, every day for 6 weeks, always to laughter, always with the plausible defense that he was just joking. It was just a funny video. Why was I being sensitive? It was the teacher who mentioned it in front of the class, meaning to be kind, saying something about how remarkable it was that one of their own students had been at the World Cup, and 15 faces in the room going immediately to the fall rather than to the fact of being selected, of being inside, of the ironed shirt and the green that had its own light. I stopped talking about the World Cup. I stopped wearing the credential, which I had planned to keep on my wall. I put it in a drawer. For approximately 2 years, I answered questions about it in the shortest possible terms and redirected conversation away from it as quickly as I could. Because every conversation about the World Cup eventually reached the fall, and every fall eventually reached the 2 seconds. And the 2 seconds were the thing I had been reduced to, and I was not yet old enough or strong enough to refuse the reduction. This is not a story about permanent damage. I want to be honest about that because the honest version is more complicated than either outcome, the pure tragedy or the clean recovery. And the complicated version is the true one. What I lost was specific. It was the story I had planned to tell about that day, the ironed shirt, the woman at the gate who blessed me, the green that had its own light, the credential around my neck on the bus home. That story existed for approximately 8 hours before it was replaced by a different story, a shorter one, 2 seconds long, And I have spent years trying to recover it, trying to insist to myself, and occasionally to others, that the longer story is the real one, that the 8 hours contain more truth than the 2 seconds, that what I was inside that stadium, selected, credentialed, part of the mechanism, is not negated by how I left it. Some days I believe that completely. Some days it requires effort. The thing that shifted, and this is the part of the story I did not expect, the part that arrived without announcement 7 years after the match, was a message I received on a platform I barely used anymore. A man, older, from a different country entirely, had tracked down my profile after seeing the clip resurface in one of those retrospective internet compilations. His message was short. He said he had watched the 2014 World Cup in a hospital waiting room while his father was in surgery, and that he had been terrified and sleepless, and that the clip of the ball boy falling had come on a television in the corner, and he had laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time in 3 days, and that his father had come through the surgery, and that the laugh had mattered, and that he had always wanted to say thank you to whoever the boy was, and that he was glad he had found me. I read it 3 times. Then I sat with it for a long time. I don't know what to do with it even now. It doesn't cancel anything. The corridor, the drawer, the 2 years of deflection. It doesn't restore the story I lost, but it adds something to it. It puts something beside the reduction that is not the reduction, and in doing so it suggests that the 2 seconds were not only what I have always experienced them as. That somewhere inside the thing that took something from me there was also, for someone, in a waiting room, in the worst week of his life, something that was briefly, unexpectedly, genuinely given. I still want potential. It is not in the drawer anymore. If these kinds of stories make you think, stay curious and never stop questioning what's hidden behind the world's biggest moments, you're in the right place. Mr. Darkveil is where we go beneath the surface, past the headlines, into the human truth that the cameras almost missed. Subscribe, and bring someone with you who's ready to see differently.